To the Monday edition of News Talk, everybody. We want to talk now about the non-military casualties of war. We're joined now by Sarah Holewinski. She's executive director of a group called CIVIC that stands for the Campaign for Innocent Victims in Conflict. She's worked for the White House AIDS policy team as well as the presidential speechwriter, also worked as a consultant to the Human Rights Watch. Good to see you. Thanks very much for coming in.
Thank you.
When I have a feeling that, your organization looks not just at Iraq, but at situations taking place across the globe. As Americans, when we think about lives lost in Iraq, we think about military,
Sure.
but it's much more than that.
It's a lot more than that, and we're rightly focused on U.S. troops that we've lost. But when you think about the number of civilian lives lost in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and then in conflicts around the world, you're dealing with these astronomical numbers. And every one of those lives lost, we need to think about as having a mother, having a father, and entire families are devastated in Iraq and Afghanistan, which is what we try to do, what we try to help.
I get the sense that our accounting, our knowledge of military deaths is much greater than civilian. Is that true?
There's no comparison. The U.S. military, and again, rightly, keeps a great record of U.S. troops lost to the battle in Iraq and Afghanistan. What they don't do is keep a public record of civilian lives lost for a number of different reasons, but we've been told over and over again that there is no public record. And one of the things that becomes a problem when you don't keep a record is you don't know how many people you're killing, you don't know how many people you're injuring, you don't know how many homes have been destroyed by bombs and airstrikes, and you don't know, most importantly, how to help them afterwards or how many people need help.
So while there might be legitimate logistical reasons why we don't know how many civilians die in combat, it's also kind of convenient because politically, even for the government to put out an estimate, it draws more attention to the loss of life, and public support for a war can rise and fall on such issues.
It does, but you know, we hear constantly that war is war and civilian lives will be lost no matter what. Now that may be true, and it's incredibly hard to avoid civilians in some of these conflict areas, particularly right now in Afghanistan with the Taliban hiding out in civilian homes, and you know, it becomes a very murky gray area. But when you claim that you are avoiding civilians as much as you possibly can, and then you don't keep a record of how many civilians you've killed, you really can't back up that claim. And that's all we're asking for.
Nor can people in democratic countries attempt to keep their leaders accountable. We can't hold our leaders accountable for yardsticks and milestones and successes and failures that we have no sort of numeric way of beginning to judge.
Look, there's a very big difference between hitting a village with an airstrike and killing 5 civilians and hitting a village with an airstrike and killing 500 civilians. And when you weigh the two, you see where you have failed, where you've made mistakes, and where you've made tremendous improvements. With the U.S. military has made improvements. We want to know why. We want to know how. We want to keep going in that direction. And if you don't keep account, you're not going to know.
What is your organization all about?
Well, CIVIC is the Campaign for Innocent Victims in Conflict, and it was started in 2003 by a young woman named Marla Ruzicka. And she was a young Californian, very bubbly, went to Afghanistan, went to Iraq, and saw the devastation for herself, what was happening there, went to the hospital, saw people with limbs blown off, children that would never get their mothers back, and started to keep a record. Brought them back to Washington, put them down on the desk of senators and said, what are you going to do about this? We need to help these people. There are U.S. bombs in their yards. What are you going to do? And in fact, she convinced U.S. senators to do something, and now the U.S. has programs to help war victims. So we continue her legacy, and now we've gone global, and we try to help war victims in every conflict zone around the world.
What are you specifically asking of the countries that are at war, where there's one nation involved in another nation, or civil strife? What kind of specific things are you after?
It's a very simple equation that we've set up that has not necessarily existed before, and that is you harm, you help. It's something that we learned in kindergarten, doesn't necessarily happen in war. So what we're saying is if you bomb a village, you must go back in afterwards. You must keep account, and you must help. You've got to compensate the civilians, whether that means rice, clothes, cash, and you've got to help them rebuild their lives. And we think that that should be the new standard in war.
We're a long way from meeting that standard in a lot of places.
We're an incredibly long way.
what do you do to try to rally support for your goal?
Well, actually, the people on the ground, of course, want us to succeed in doing this because they need help and they're suffering and they've had their lives devastated. But the U.S. is leading the way in this, and that's a place where all of us Americans can be really proud of what our country is doing. Mm-hmm. And that is, we have compensation. Whenever the U.S. forces harm an innocent civilian, they get compensated. And we've got programs to help them rebuild their lives, and that's something that hasn't happened before in the history of warfare, and certainly not in the history of the United States. So we're moving in the right direction. It's just a matter of getting the entire world to rally around this new concept.
We're quite aware of some of the world's hotspots where we happen to be most intensely involved. What are some of the places where civilian lives are being lost because of military fighting of one sort or another that might not be on the radar, might not be front of mind for some of the people watching?
Sure. Well, and that's one of the things we try to do is, everyone is focused on Iraq and Afghanistan right now, but in fact, civilians are suffering the world over, and unfortunately, you can't even count them on two hands. You've got Nepal and Sri Lanka. I just visited those two places. You've got tons of places in Africa, Congo and Cote d'Ivoire, where civilians have suffered. And of course, you've got Darfur and Sudan, which everyone is paying attention to, but in terms of getting these people help after the conflict has stopped, that's something that's going to take a long time and a lot of negotiation.
Who could, and the UN comes to mind, but they might not be the only one. Who could help all of us understand the enormity of the problem? In other words, when military people go to battle in many countries, we know when they don't come back, and that's
right.
That's an accounting that's relatively easy, painful but easy. What do we do to get a sense of the problem so we can
Well, I don't know that it will be left up to militaries. I think it's going to be left up to people like ourselves to care. There are journalists like yourself who are out there and who are getting these stories and publicizing them, saying, here's what's happening in Afghanistan, here's the family that lost 8 family members. And it's going to take people like myself who care about this issue to go around the world and to collect these stories and to let people know what's happening.
Talk about some of your background and how that has prepared you for this work. Dealing with the Clinton Foundation in Rwanda. Rwanda, a particular moment, I know for the president, he's talked about it pretty passionately. Yeah. Talk about your own background.
I think nothing can prepare you for this kind of work in particular, because it's such a devastating topic. But you learn that when you deal with these kind of topics, as Ms. Holmes Norton has so many times before, you find the small areas of hope that you can cling to. And so when I was working in Rwanda with the Clinton Foundation, I was working with 40 African First Ladies on HIV/AIDS. And you see the amount of devastation, but you also see the incredible hope that people have that someday this scourge will be over. And as you're working, as I'm working, and my staff, and all of these people who are rallying around Civic, as we're working toward a new norm in warfare where civilians are helped instead of harmed. That gives you hope. Someday it will happen.
Do we know how many civilians have died in Iraq?
We don't. And we don't specifically because it is, to use a technical term, it's a mess over there. And so you've got 50,000, 100,000, 600,000 has been the highest estimate thus far.
So a range that's so wide, it's almost comical. Of course, it's tragic, but I mean, we were so in the dark.
We're so in the dark, and when you compare 50,000 to 600,000, if we were comparing those numbers here in the United States, I can tell you that somebody would be checking into this, and somebody would be making sure that there was a count being kept, an accurate count being kept. Unfortunately, over there, it's not only incredibly difficult, but again, the U.S. military is not keeping a count.
Are there other nations that are doing relatively well, that are coming close to the standard and the goal you've set?
In Afghanistan, you've got the NATO coalition, so you've got 26 countries. Some of them are coming close. The Netherlands is fantastic. You've got some of those countries. The U.S. is really leading the way on this, and I'm very proud that the U.S. has taken a leadership role, but we need everyone to do better.
And when did Civic get started?
Civic was started in 2003, and Marla Ruzicka, our founder, was killed, unfortunately, in 2005 on Airport Road in Baghdad.
What happened?
Suicide bomber hit her convoy. She was actually just about to go and meet with some families that she was trying to help. So we took over last year and hope to continue her legacy. It was just amazing, visionary, and we hope to continue that.
Another civilian casualty of war.
Another civilian casualty.
Sarah Holewinski is executive director of the group called Civic. You can reach them online. Their website is civicworldwide.org. Civicworldwide.org. Thanks for your time, and keep us posted on your efforts.
My pleasure.
Good to visit with you. Thanks very much for coming in. We'll take a quick break here. When we come back, we'll talk to you about tomorrow's News Talk. We'll see you then.